I love Appalachia. It stands as one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, rich in scenic views and history. I used to go with my family every single year to experience these things, and I would also go to check out the somewhat sketchy knife shops in Gatlinburg because I wanted the really big sword on the wall. However, if you've ever visited these ancient landmarks, similar to the knife shops, you know it can get very weird out there. Hi, my name is Monty Moth, and today we'll be talking about one of the most strange cases that I've ever read into, the lost children of the Alleghenies. Although the case starts out very simple, as each detail is inserted, it becomes more complex and more eluded with mysticism and just supernatural things. So if that sounds interesting to you, let's get on with the story. But before anything, thank you for watching. Our story begins with a couple of the names Samuel and Susanna Cox. Being born on May 1815 and November 1827 respectively, the couple had grown up in the same town of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and got married there in 1847. A couple years later, they had their first kids known as George and Joseph Cox. Soon after the birth of Joseph, they moved from Pennsylvania to Indiana for a change in scenery, but also for a chance of opportunity. However, fate seemed to not be on their side, as where they were moving in Indiana was running rampant with malaria. The family eventually contracted the disease, and they struggled for months day to day with their health, until finally they decided for the sake of well-being, they would move back to Pennsylvania into Spruce Hollow Forest and build a cabin. Spruce Hollow Forest is near Pavia, Pennsylvania, in the Alleghenies Mountains, a section of the Appalachian Mountains. After some time, they built up their cabin and they set up their life, and it seemed to be working well, and the mountain air seemed to be helping the medical complications with their kids, with George, the older brother, starting to grow in his personality and becoming protective of his younger brother. George was always making sure that his little brother Joseph was out of harm's way, and this was really detailed in Charles McCarthy's book, The Lost Children of the Alleghenies, which a lot of information will be coming from in this video. With the Cox family starting to become self-sufficient, it seemed that things were starting to look up for the family and they were able to get past what they'd gone through in Indiana, and that is until tragedy would strike. On the morning of April 24th, 1856, the family would be sitting around the table eating breakfast when the father Samuel heard their dog barking outside. The way their dog was barking, Samuel recognized this as the bark he would make when he had treed a squirrel. Finishing his breakfast, Samuel would get up and grab his rifle to go find the dog, which was about 1/8 of a mile from where the cabin stood in the woods. After about an hour and a half, Samuel would come back empty-handed, wasn't able to find anything, and he was expecting to see the kids at the cabin when he saw no one except his wife. Both parents looked at each other in confusion, assuming that each other had the kids with them, and so they searched around this plot of land that they had around their cabin, which was very small compared to the huge amount of woods around them. And once they weren't able to find the kids, they just assumed that they went into the trail of where Samuel went to try to follow him, and Samuel came back a different path, so that way they didn't meet up at all. The couple began to panic, and they ran into the woods to call out the names of George and Joseph to see if they had any callback at all, and eventually ran back to the cabin to see if there was some off chance that they had come back, and unfortunately the kids were still missing. So in a desperate plea for help, they ran to their neighbors that were in the surrounding woods to help them find their kids because they were subject to the wilderness around them. The news spread like wildfire, and half of the helpers got on the mountain to help search, while the other half got on their horses and went to nearby townships and other local areas to pretty much spread the word and get more helpers involved. Overall, with the word of mouth and everything, by the end of the night, there were about 200 people helping search this mountain for these two missing boys. And though the good amount of people that were helping search this mountain was a positive sign and a thing to look up to for these parents, the dark clouds emerging and the dropping temperatures were not. However, the father Samuel pleaded for the neighbors and for the helpers to just keep searching through the night because these boys could not handle the bitter cold that was to come to the mountain that night, and out of pure pity or the eagerness to help or both, they all decided to still search throughout the night. Through the night, helpers would search and they would actually set up campfires to hope that the boys would come to the light to where they could get rest and food and be safely transported back to their house. Unfortunately though, there would be no luck on the first night either, And by the second day, there were 1,000 people helping search this mountain, with half of them going to new areas of the mountain to search, and the other half going back to where they had already searched and going and combing over the area just to make sure that they hadn't missed them along the way. And this pattern would repeat and repeat and repeat until the events that happened on the third day. On April 27th, 1856, the search was going normally as planned until there was a man who decided that there was something up with the situation. A man by the name of Charlie Ross and a few other searchers rallied together and accused Susanna and Samuel Cox of murdering their children and profiting from the donations from the community. And before the parents could even defend themselves, the small mob of people bust into their cabin and start just ripping things off shelves, start ripping up floorboards, and they start taking out things in the garden like potatoes that they had planted to see if there were bodies or any signs of murder that had happened with their kids, George and Joseph. However, after some time, they came up with nothing, and out of either embarrassment or just fear of what would happen to them, the small group of people fled the search and actually fled the area until the search was concluded. This overall just leaving a bit of pain with the Cox family and with the parents being accused of such a horrific thing that they would never even dream of doing. The search did continue for the next few days, and people began to fear the worst as there was no evidence of the boys and the temperatures were steadily declining. Through these next couple of days, there would be rumors that would sprout with the helpers of what actually happened with the boys. One of them was that a band of gypsies decided to kidnap the kids and take them wherever they wanted, while another group believed that there was maybe some type of religious cult going on in the woods and they had taken the children and trapped them in a monastery. Others believed more grounded theories that they might have drowned in a mountain stream known as Bob's Creek, which we will get to later. And others believed that they might have fallen prey to wildcats and panthers in the area. These rumors circled with the search party until about the 5th or 6th night when a woman by the name of Bentimer experienced something chilling. You see, Bentimer lived at the foot of the mountain, and as she was getting ready for bed that night, she claimed to have heard crying children coming from outside of her cabin and in the woods of the mountain. And as anyone who heard crying children at night in the woods would do, she went to her neighbors to create a small search team and go and look for them, but alas, they found no one. Once what happened to Bentimer kind of spread around on the mountain and the searchers there, people started to get desperate of trying to find these kids, and so this is where the story kind of takes a little bit of a kooky turn. Although the Cox family was religious and they did not believe in superstition, there were a lot of searchers that started to find George and Joseph by supernatural means, which is actually not a very rare occurrence as this happens today in cases. Due to this, there was a man from Morrison's Cove that was a well-renowned dowser who claimed he could find the Cox boys. If you don't know what a dowser is, and I didn't know this either until a couple years ago, until I watched Minari, thank you Minari for educating me on what a dowser is. A dowser is someone who is able to identify things underground, so basically water, ores, metal, gems, oil, and in some cases bodies. They are able to find the locations of things underground by the usage of a pointer, which is usually 2 metal rods that they hold, but they also sometimes use forked sticks, which is what the man used in this story. Now, the exact date of when the dowser decided to try to find the Cox boys is not exactly recorded. We can assume or make an educated guess that it was probably around when Bentimer shared her news of hearing about the crying children, because I'm sure the searchers became very desperate at that point. Plus, at this point, we have to keep in mind that it's been a full week, and so yeah, people were really trying to find any means necessary of finding George and Joseph. The dowser was joined by a small group of searchers, and he claimed that he could lead them right to the boys no problem. However, it's written that after a couple of hours of searching through the woods, some searchers noticed that he kind of just seemed lost, and after a couple more hours, they realized that he didn't really know what he was doing, and so they called off the search. And they even make note that if the group wasn't with him to help him out of the woods, he would have been lost in there along with the Cox boys. However, around the same time as the other searchers, there was another group of searchers that set out for a woman in Somerset County that claimed to be a witch and stated that she had conjuration magic, according to McCarthy. In fact, witches were pretty prominent in the Appalachians, especially in this section of the Alleghenies Mountains. I'd love to cover it on a separate video because I would do it in here, but it's a whole can of worms in itself. But I linked some resources in the description if you're interested. The witch came to the site and stated that she could see the children in visions she was having. She stated that the boys were actually doing well in the woods and said that they were living off the land by eating chestnuts that had fallen off the ground and sleeping in their leaf beds under thick pieces of laurel to protect themselves from the rain or snow. However, right after this, she requested that she get paid to then take them to the kids, which might not be the best sign. So the searchers did pay her, and she said that they would find the kids by 10 o'clock the next morning, and off they went into the woods to search for the rest of the day. It's stated by McCarthy that there was no issue at all on the first night of the search, and when they'd gotten to a stopping point, the witch said she needed to rest to continue on to the next day, but they would no problem find the boys by 10 o'clock. However, they started the search on the next day, and at 10 o'clock there was no sign of the boys. And then 11 o'clock, and then 12 o'clock. And then 1 o'clock. Later that night, they continued searching and stopped, and the witch requested food and water and said that she needed to rest, but that the boys were not far away and that they would find them no problem the next day. So the group set up camp, and they sat and slept on the cold mountain until they woke up the next morning. And as you can imagine, they searched for the next day until about midday, and there was still no sign of the boys, and the witch then proceeded to sit down and state that she was feeling ill and that she needed to go home. So, needless to say, the witch search was not necessarily successful. Overall, the search with the self-proclaimed witch turned out to be a 2-day venture, which at this point the clock is really ticking on finding these kids. Not only was the clock ticking on finding these boys, but the search party was also feeling defeated by the fact that they just lost a good amount of money on hiring the dowser and the witch with nothing to come up. All seemed lost until something very strange happened on the 10th night of the search. 12 miles away of where the search was happening, there was a farmer by the name of Jacob Dibbert who was going to bed. Expecting to go to bed and wake up the next morning like nothing happened, Jacob has this very odd dream. In his dream, Jacob is walking through a forest that he is unfamiliar with and comes across a dead deer. Taking note of this, he keeps walking down the trail and not far from it finds a worn-out shoe from a child. As his curiosity grew, he begins to walk further down the trail until he gets to a large stream, to where he crosses it on a beach log that had fallen over it. He then traveled over what is known as Blue Ridge and then comes out into a small ravine where a stream is trickling out from the mountain rocks. Following the stream, he comes into a clearing of birch trees and notices that one of them seems off compared to the others. This particular birch tree had the top broken off, either due to lightning or wind or what have you, and as he scanned down to the roots of the trees, what else does he find but the Cox boys dead? He focuses on the bodies and he sees that there had been bruising and lacerations all in their bodies and that their clothes had been ripped up. Immediately upon seeing this, he wakes up and remembers every single detail that had happened in the dream. You see, this bothered Jacob, obviously because of what he saw, but because he was not a superstitious type and he believed dreams were just dreams, but for some reason this particular dream was so seared into his mind. So Jacob wakes up the next day and tells his wife about his dream and asks her if she knew of any location that sounded like his dream. And his wife was taken aback because she did grow up in this forest of where the search was taking place, and she knew exactly of a location that fit that description. So there was a part of Jacob that did want to go and search for these boys, but due to him not wanting to be labeled as crazy and him not being superstitious, he just kind of wrote it off as just a one-off thing. However, as much as he tried to shake it off, for the next 3 nights he would have this same reoccurring dream where he follows the path and eventually leads to the dead bodies of George and Joseph Cox. After the 3rd night of dreaming it, he decided to do something about it, and his wife recommended that he go see his brother-in-law, Harrison Wysong, who lived in the area of where the search was taking place. So Jacob traveled to Harrison's house and told him about the dream, and he said that he needed to figure out if this was true or not, if not to find the boys for just ease of mind. However, when Harrison learned of this dream and he recognized where this location was in the woods, he stated that it was ridiculous to go even look because there was no way that the boys would have been able to get to that location. You see, from where the Cox family lived, that was 5 or 6 miles away from the spot Jacob dreamed of, and there was Bob's Creek right in the center of it. Bob's Creek is the body of water I mentioned earlier in the story where people thought that the kids might have drowned in it, and you might think a creek is really not that big, but it was really higher than usual due to all the snow melting off the mountain that spring. Regardless, Jacob stated that he was going to go search with or without Harrison, and out of fear of him being lost in the woods, Harrison agrees to go with him. The two begin walking into the forest, and what do you know? They come across a dead deer after some miles of walking. And as they continue down the trail, they find the child's shoe, which turns out to be Joseph's later on, and they continue further, going through every single step that Jacob had dreamed of. This led them all the way to that clearing of birch trees where they do find the bodies of George and Joseph exactly in the state that Jacob had dreamed of. The two decided to go spread the word, and by 11 o'clock on May 8th, 1856, all 4,000 searchers on the mountain heard of the news and went to the site of where the Cox boys were. Now, luckily, because there were so many searchers on the mountain, there were physicians there to assess the scene. It's written that their bodies were completely deprived of nutrients, and so they were basically skin and bone, and there were multiple cuts and lacerations on their body, presumably from the thorn bushes or surrounding the area. This is also the explanation of why their clothes were so worn out and shredded up, even though they had been brand new not too long ago. The physicians detail that Joseph died first, and George then proceeded to grab a stone from the stream nearby and place it under his little brother's head and place his hat above it to act as a pillow. And George then proceeded to cry over his brother and ask him to wake up and why he wasn't moving. And after some time, out of exhaustion or starvation, George then proceeded to lay down next to his brother and pass away as well, which hits really hard as an older brother, so it's terrible. Physicians believe they had been sitting there lifeless for about 3 to 4 days, and many people came to see them, along with the father who had to be assisted to the scene as he wept over the bodies of his children. As soon as it could be arranged, a sled was brought up to the site where the boys' bodies were placed, and they were carried to the Cox family's home, which was about 6 or 7 miles away. They were kept there until the following Sabbath, where the funeral would then take place, and McCarthy stated it was one of the biggest funerals in that area of the United States, with up to 5,000 people attending the service. Both children were placed into one coffin, and they were buried in Mount Union Cemetery in Bedford County, Pennsylvania, where they still lie to this day. Overall, $5,000 had been donated from provisions and money and etc. Throughout the course of the search, and that equates over to a little under $154,000 today. And as you remember, the search started out with about 100 helpers by the end of the first night, and that went up a ton by 4,000 helpers being present by the 15th and final day of the search. And as you remember from earlier in the story, there were about 100 helpers by the end of the first night, and that had grown exponentially with 4,000 searchers being present on the 15th and final day of the search. A reward of $50 was given to Jacob Dibbert for finding the children, and that equates to about $1,500 today, but he did not find it suitable to keep the money, so he gave it to the Cox family to where they could buy a gravestone for their children. The nightmare that loomed over this community faded in time, and Susanna and Samuel Cox actually expanded their family, having more kids later on, and actually making a new cabin on the same property because they had to keep up with the rooms with how many children they were having. There was a sense of melancholy and sadness that came over Susanna and Samuel when asked about George and Joseph, but in the end they knew that one day they would be reunited together in the afterlife. Samuel passed away in 1896, with Susanna not long to follow in 1899. In 1906, the 50th anniversary of the Cox boys being found, the township of Pavia set up a donation system to set up a monument to honor the Cox family of where the Cox boys were found. The monument was eventually built in 1910, and it still can be visited to this day. So if you just wanted to hear the story, that is it. Thank you for sticking around, and thanks for watching. But if you want to continue with me, I'm going to get into some theories because, what happened? I mean, you've got this story where these kids go missing. There's no evidence of them at all for 15 days. where there's 4,000 people searching this mountain, and you've got a guy who's having prophetic dreams about where they are, and it turns out to be true. I mean, you've got people accusing the parents of killing them. I mean, what's going on? So we're going to get into some theories. Because even though this is a open and shut case to the town of Pavia, I found a lot of differing research and opinions on what happened online, and I want to discuss them because it's interesting. There are people who are more qualified than me and actually have education in criminology, but I'm going to do it anyway. So let's start with theory 1, what Charlie Ross believed, that Samuel and Susanna Cox killed George and Joseph. No. Just kidding, but without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, I do not think Susanna or Samuel Cox killed their kids. For one, they're living out in the middle of a remote forest in 1856, so I feel like if they had any type of desire to commit such a heinous act, they could probably do so without people knowing. And not to mention, there's not much of a police presence at this time, not that I could find, so if there was one, it was very minimal, or it was just among the townsfolk to uphold. And this is not by any means a jab at the townsfolk, I'm just stating that we have a lot of information and knowledge about homicide cases today that was not present in the past. And if the parents were ever questioned about why their kids were missing, I mean, they're living out in the elements here, and they're living in a cabin, so it's like they could say that the kids fell to beasts of prey, or that there was some type of logging accident, who knows? So I don't find it very believable when they ran to neighbors as soon as they found out they were missing. And you gotta think, these neighbors are not just like in a cul-de-sac. I mean, they're like far apart from each other. So, I mean, it's just, I don't find it very suitable. Unless there are some cases where the perpetrator does want to get involved with the search. That way they do look innocent. In fact, that kind of lines up with Charlie Ross's accusations, where he believed that they set up this thing where they had killed their kids, and that the donations and provisions being given from the community were being taken by the Cox family, and they were just merely profiting off of it. However, this doesn't really line up either, because you got to think that the Cox family wanted to live in this remote forest, and they wanted to live off the land and be self-sufficient. So what exactly is the purpose of having a lot of money? McCarthy even mentions it in his book that if the Cox family ever wanted wealth, then they definitely would not have moved to Spruce Hollow Forest, because there was not a lot of wealth to be found there. Also, there is one more detail about this that I'm going to really just throw out there, and I did not mention this earlier in the story on purpose. See, Samuel and Susanna Cox did have 2 boys, and they moved from Indiana and then back to Pennsylvania, and they lived until that fateful morning. However, during that span of moving, they actually had 2 more daughters known as Anna Josephine Cox and Sarah Marie Cox. In fact, they had another daughter on October 22nd, 1856, which was months after the search was concluded, so that means that Suzanne was literally pregnant while all this was going on. Sarah Marie Cox was actually even questioned by a newspaper called the Perry County Democrat in 1931, where she was recalling memories of what happened that morning. She was 4 years old the morning of the disappearance, and she said she remembered everything from the boys leaving to the parents coming back and them freaking out and them asking for help and a ton of people being there. And the reason I bring up the daughters is because that, and this is somewhat grim, but if your intent was to hurt your 2 boys and make sure they were never found again, why would you stop at the daughters? Nonetheless, you had another child on the way, so why would you be trying to continue a family while doing this? Overall, the possibilities just don't really add up, at least to me, and that's not without a lack of trying, as Charlie and a group of people, remember, went through their whole house and dug up floorboards and gardens, and they found nothing. So it's dumb. I don't like Charlie Ross. He's dumb. He's a big, dumb, stinky, dumb head. Next theory. So this theory is what I found a lot online, and I'm not going to lie, I was kind of in that same boat until I read more in the details of the story. I mean, for thousands of people to be combing the forest, and then one day a random farmer says that he found the boys through a dream and he was the only person to find the boys in that location, yeah, it's a little weird. However, again, with bits of context added in, it does become a little less suspicious. One key factor of why Jacob probably had nothing to do with this is because he lived pretty far away from where the Cox boys were found. See, Jacob Dibbert lived on a farm about 3 miles away from a village called Claysburg in Pennsylvania, and McCarthy even states in the book that the distance between Jacob Dibbert's farm and where the Cox boys were found was about 12 miles apart. Which, knowing the exact location of where the boys were found based off of the monument put up in 1910, we can guess Jacob lived 3 miles east of Claysburg, as when we drag the distance tracker on here, it equals out to about 12 miles total, and as we remember in the story, when the boys were found, they were sledded back to their home west for about 6 or 7 miles, making the total distance between Jacob's house and Samuel Cox's house be around 18 to 19 miles apart. Now you gotta remember, the main means of transportation at this time was walking or horseback, so if Jacob wanted to do these terrible things, why would he go to a remote cabin 18 to 19 miles away in the middle of the forest when he lived only 3 miles away from a settlement with a higher density of people? Sure, you could say it's because it would be more secluded like we mentioned in Theory 1, but the time it would take for Jacob to walk from his farm to the Cox family cabin would take about 7 hours and 45 minutes. Not to mention, this is unpaved roads and dense untamed forest, so it might take even longer to make such a walk. And then he would have to walk back another 7 hours and 45 minutes in the same day, which might make it unfeasible. But what about the horses, Monty, you may ask? Well, buddy, you're wrong! An average horse takes about a 19-mile trip and back would be roughly under 10 hours at an average pace of about 4 miles per hour. Not to mention, the horse would be exhausted after about 30 miles, so it may take even more time. Good luck, buddy. And this is only a walking horse too, but if we made the horse do some cantips or a couple of gallops, well then yeah, it would make the time shorter but much more feasible, possibly getting there in about 1.5 hours. But he's got to have a super fit horse for that. I mean, that horse has got to be doing in the MLB, doing roids. I mean, if he wanted to kidnap these poor kids, would he just hitch them on a horse like they're riding pals? No! His only option would be to run in the woods, but that doesn't make sense because then what happens to the horse unless he was working with Harrison? But that's so much organization, and the plot of the land, and the Cox family lived on the very small land, so I mean it would be hard to hide. And furthermore, that would be quite a ruckus for Susanna to hear, and you know, it wouldn't make Hey, no, don't turn off this video. No, I'm talking to you. Don't turn it off. No, stay on the video. So, yeah, needless to say, he lived really far away. That it doesn't really make sense. Jacob also didn't grow up in Pavia where they were searching, so his lay of the land and where things were was very limited, to say the least. Now, after 15 days of searching, it is a little weird that him and Harrison were the only 2 people to find the boys out of 4,000. That is, until you look up the exact pattern of the search party. You see, the search was taking place near the Cox family's cabin, and people were being elected leaders who were grown up in the area and were familiar with the lay of the land. So the leaders would get people, and the people would line side to side, and they would comb these forests all the way through. Now, with that system, you would think the boys would be found no problem. But the issue is that one of the parameters or the borders of where they would stop searching is at Bob's Creek. And since the Cox family lived on the west side of Bob's Creek, they did not search at all the east side of the creek because, again, everyone just assumed that the boys would not have made it across. Again, a creek doesn't sound very menacing, and you think that a kid would be able to cross it no problem, but you gotta think that George was 7 years old at this time and Joseph was 5 years old. And the average weight of boys this age are about 40 to 50 pounds, and their height's usually about 3'7" to 4 foot. And Bob's Creek can make waves up to 3 feet tall and has a very strong current, so it's somewhat safe to assume that a child would not be able to cross it. I'm sure what happened was that the boys did find a log across the creek, kind of like what Jacob did, and so they got on the east side of the creek to where Jacob would find them later on. That being said, that is why Jacob and Harrison were the only 2 people to find them, because they were the only people searching on the east side of Bob's Creek. Another thing is that Jacob had no known relation with the Cox family, at least that's what's documented. The only reason that Jacob knew what was going on with the search was that he heard it at church, which was on the 4th day of the search. So finally, why were the boys found with their clothes worn out and tore up and having lacerations and scratches all over their body? Well, we gotta remember this is untamed forest, and this is before parks and clearing out vegetation and everything, so there were plenty of plants to scratch them up, like the thorn bushes we mentioned earlier, not to mention wildlife that could also scratch them up as well. On the day they were found, physicians stated that they had been dead for about 3 to 4 days beforehand, So that means that they could have been walking around this untamed and unkempt forest for 11 days straight. All of this being said, I don't think it's impossible that Jacob could have been involved with these boys' death, but I find it pretty unlikely due to the circumstances. I mean, you gotta think of where the Cox boys were found, how many days it had been, how they got to that location in the first place. Jacob lived so far away. I mean, there could have been a chance that Jacob met them in the woods somehow, just in the middle of all this, but I think the possibility of that's very slim. So I personally don't think that there's a lot of foul play involved. And that gets us to our final question of, how did Jacob know exactly where the boys were? Did he actually have a prophetic dream, or is he just kind of coming up with some story? And so that leads us into our third theory. So let's say everything that happened in the story did actually happen. So the boys went missing on April 24th. The parents were accused on the third day. Some nights later, their cries were heard, possibly on the mountain. Might have been a skinwalker. I don't know. Again, Appalachia can be a weird area. The boys would have passed away on the 11th day, and Jacob and Harrison would soon find them on the east side of Bob's Creek on the 15th day of the search. Now, I have two theories when it comes to Jacob's dream. Let's call them Theory 3.1, Theory 3.2. 3.1 is going to be a lot more fun than 3.2. Now, as grand as it is to claim that you've had a prophetic dream, it's maybe not as far-fetched as it might seem. What Jacob might have experienced is what is known now as a precognitive dream, where basically you have a dream and it's vivid and things happen and it turns out to be real. And there have actually been some very famous cases of precognitive dreams. One of them being Abraham Lincoln, where prior to him being assassinated some days before, he actually had a dream where he attended his own funeral. In the dream, he asks what happened to the man in the casket, and a man turns to him and says that the president had been assassinated. And there are a couple other stories that have to do with precognitive dreams, like with Mark Twain and the Titanic and a couple others. I highly recommend looking them up. They're actually really interesting. Now, there's not a lot of scientific evidence to say that dreams can predict the future. But there are three factors that separate precognitive dreams from regular dreams. So we'll go through those real quick. So the first factor is that the dream needs to be very vivid and it needs to have some detail that you remember. And this can be found with Jacob's dream, as with the dead deer, the missing shoe, etc. The second factor is that you need to tell someone of this dream before it actually happens, therefore making it a prophetic dream. And this did happen with Jacob when he decided to tell his wife the next day, and eventually telling Harrison. The third and final factor is that the dream actually has to happen, which it apparently, according to Jacob, did happen on the 15th day of the search. And to add another layer to this, McCarthy writes of a case happening in 1887, years later on the same exact mountain, where a girl by the name of Sidney Griffith goes missing. Sidney Griffith is stuck in the woods for 2 days and 2 nights, and all hope seems lost until who else has a dream of where she is than Jacob's son, Isaac Dibbert. Isaac would then wake up the next day and go exactly where he dreamed of where she would be, and it turns out she was there, and she then went on to live the rest of her days. So really, who am I to say that he did not have this prophetic dream or a precognitive dream, or if this wasn't some form of divine intervention? Because the fact that he had it for 3 nights straight and then goes to Harrison's house and argues with him to go into the woods because he was so convinced that this was real, it totally could be possible. However, there's the flip side of 3.2, where basically they might have felt bad about the situation and they went and searched for the boys and stumbled across them and decided to make up this story to sound cool, which would really suck and be lame if that were true. There are plenty of other theories of what could happen. I mean, there's so many just layers to this thing, but overall, what happened was a terrible tragedy, and it should have never happened in the first place. However, it has become a permanent landmark in history for Bedford County, Pennsylvania, and there is a little bit of peace to be found where Samuel and Susanna Cox did eventually live on their days to expand their family and make more memories and eventually be reunited with their lost children of the Alleghenies. And I believe that is it for this video. If you stuck around this long, thank you for watching. I know it was kind of a lot, but I found this case really interesting, and honestly, I really enjoy talking about this stuff. So if you really like it, let me know and I'll do more. Also, we made it to the 10 subscriber milestone. I am the next Mr. Beast. I am Mr. YouTube. I'm Mr. Internet. I think I'm now going to go take a nap because this was a lot to research, but I had a lot of fun doing it. I did some deep dives. I read some newspapers from the 1930s, which I can't say I do often, so I want to do more of that. As always, thank you for watching. Again, I know I've said that so many times, but it means a lot when I find out that people actually watch what I make. And yeah, so I'm gonna go sleep. Bye.